After 40 years of X11, we have an uncountable number of window managers, many of which have been completely lost to the sands of time. Most people don't even remember they ever existed, but some of the earliest still actually have users. For example, TWM, Tom's Window Manager, Tab Window Manager, Timeless Window Manager, various other names have been used over the years. Here is a rice from 2022. This first released in 1987. TWM predates Linux. Being such an early window manager, with X11 only coming out 3 years prior in 1984, TWM has been a very influential project, and a lot of very important things have stemmed off of it. But I don't want to talk about TWM directly today. Instead, I want to talk about one of those projects that stemmed off of it, and then a bunch of things that stemmed off of that. Did you know that both XFWM, the XFCE window manager, and Enlightenment both stem from the exact same project, that being FVWM, at one point being called the Feeble Virtual Window Manager, but over the years it lost its name, and now it's just the F Virtual Window Manager. This project was started by Robert Nation to solve two main problems. Firstly, make TWM use less memory. Back in the late 80s and early 90s, computing resources were a lot more limited than they are today. Nowadays, you can get away with having a fairly inefficient window manager, and in the grand scheme of your system, it's not really going to matter that much because the web browser is going to use way more resources anyway. Back then, though, it was a bit more of a deal. The second major reason is adding in support for virtual desktops. Nowadays, it really doesn't matter what the desktop is. It can be a random little window manager or a desktop environment managed by a company. It is going to have support for a virtual desktop. Now, some projects do virtual desktops wrong, like KDE, but it still has support for them. Back in 1993, though, this was not something you could take for granted. At this point, virtual desktops in X11 had only been a thing for about 4 years at this point, introduced in 1989 with SWM, the Soulborn window manager, made by Tom Lestrange. Tom, the same Tom from Tom's Window Manager. He's not the one who first invented the concept of a virtual desktop, though. The initial date is a little bit weird because there's technically two definitions. The first one is work in 1986 at Xerox PARC by Austin Henderson and Stuart Card. They called these rooms. What they didn't know at this point is in 1984, there was very similar work by Peter Patrick Chan, but that's a story for a whole separate video. Now, if you know your Unix history, you might recognize the name Robert Nation, because he also made a very important terminal, RxVT. Not URXVT, that's the newer Unicode supporting version. I mean the original version of RxVT. And thanks to X11 and Xorg being a fairly unmoving target nowadays, you can still run FVWM today. But there is also another project called FVWM3, which is still being maintained. This was made by Thomas Adam. It's certainly not one of the big popular window managers that everybody knows about, but it is really cool that there is a project keeping such a long legacy alive. Now, like TWM, FVWM was also a very important window manager, and a lot of really cool projects ended up spawning off of it. The first one being Window Maker. So this is the Window Maker website. It is made to emulate the look and feel of the Window Maker window manager. I've done a full video on Window Maker in the past. I highly recommend you go and check it out. But this is inspired by another system called OpenStep, an application framework based on the NextStep OS developed for Sun's Microsystem OS. Now, you might recognize the name Next. Next was the company that Steve Jobs would have made after he got booted out of Apple. Whilst the hardware sold terribly, it was incredibly overpriced and really only got bought by like tech enthusiasts, which was a very small group back then, and universities. It was a very influential system introducing UI and design concepts that we still see in modern computers today. And because it was such a weird cultural phenomenon, there was a lot of projects that tried to emulate that look and feel, Window Maker being one of them. Now, another project that stemmed off of FVWM was Bowman, otherwise known as Boyang's Window Manager. Again, this tried to emulate what was done by Next, but they decided to very quickly rebrand, now going by AfterStep, and the website still exists today. The latest release was in 2013, with a couple of commits being made since then, so it's not like it's still in active development, but this had a very interesting idea. It didn't want to just be NextStep, OpenStep, or Window Maker again. It wanted to see what was going to come after that. What would have happened if Next was actually successful? What would have happened if they kept going down that route? This was supposed to be what happened after that. Technically, we already do know what happened to NextStep. There is a very good reason why Apple acquired Next Computer. That became the basis for OS X. But obviously, OS X is very, very different from what was left with NextStep and OpenStep. Now, not every fork of FVWM was a clone of NextStep. Some of them were a clone of another operating system. So you know how nowadays there are people that have these Windows 7 KDE themes, or Windows XP, or Windows 95? Well, even back in the 90s, people were already doing this. There was a fork called FVWM 95, a Windows 95 clone, and this wasn't built for nostalgia. Windows 95 was the current version of Windows. On that note, there was also another version called FVWM 98, and can you guess what that was a clone of? Here's a fun fact. FVWM 95 was actually quite popular at the time, and it was the default desktop being used on Red Hat Linux 5.0. This is not like Enterprise Linux 5.0. I mean the original Red Hat Linux 5.0. How about a clone of another desktop? This one is called AmiWM, made by Marcus Comstead. This was made to look like Amiga Workbench in 1992, before the swap to Amiga OS in 1994. Here is what it looks like. The purpose of AmiWM is to make life more pleasant for Amiga freaks like myself, who has/wants to use Unix workstations once in a while. It can also be used on the Amiga with the AmiWM X server, although this part needs some more work. This had a new version as of last year. It's a very minor version, but still, somebody is still developing this. We have one more clone left. This one is called MLVWM. This is a clone of macOS. And I don't mean macOS as in the rename of OS X. I mean a clone of macOS. You can either have it look like macOS 7 or an 8 or 9 like look. Look, it's not my style, but I get it. I get people who grew up with a system like this and want to have their desktop look like it. And in 2001, this forked into another project called Haze, which has a website. I wouldn't call it a great website. But it exists. And the desktop looks something like this. This is a really bad demonstration. You have stuff everywhere. Let's try another one. Why does this person like to have windows covering everything? Here we go. Again, not my feel, but I get it. Our next window manager is very weird, and I think is one of the most unique window managers I've ever seen. SCWM, Scheme Constraint Window Manager. Nowadays, we have two main ways to manage windows. Floating or stacking, where you can just put windows wherever you want, they can be overlapping each other, basically the Windows model. The other option is tiling, where windows are placed into predefined tiles, and then when you make a new window, they are placed in new locations based on some algorithm being used or manual direction being selected. SCWM does it very differently, where window placement is defined by a user-controlled scheme. Say you want to have windows always be an equal distance apart, or one window always larger than another by 50%, or all of them be equal height, or when you close one window, another window is closed as well. Basically, take the idea of window rules and take it to its logical conclusion and base the entire window management around that system. This is a really powerful system that is completely useless if you don't understand how to configure it. But much like being a Vim user, if you've used it for 1 year, 5 years, 10 years, it's going to be one of those things where what you do looks like complete magic to anybody looking at your system. If you understood the GNU GUI-inspired configuration, you could perfectly replicate a tiling window manager workflow, for example, or basically anything else. On the topic of weird window managers is another one called Matisse, and this is really weird. It describes itself as 2.5D. This has features like per window scaling, temporary elastic operations, a zoomable desktop, and what it describes as tabletop flip mode. And of course, those what I started with, XFWM and Enlightenment. But Enlightenment actually had a step in between, FVWM XPM. Not much is really known about this project anymore, except the fact that it was German. That's the case with a lot of these old projects. There isn't a lot of really well-documented history on them, because many of them were made pre-internet or early internet, where a lot of the things have just, once again, been lost to time. All of these really neat projects stemmed off of one really neat project back in the 80s, and I'm sure there are other forks out there that probably are worth mentioning. But these are the ones I talked about today, so let me know your thoughts down below. Did you learn something new? Were you aware of any of these desktops before? I would love to know. So if you liked the video, go like the video. And if you really like the video and you want to become one of these amazing people over here, check out the Patreon, Scribes, LiberaPay linked in the description down below. That's going to be it for me, and what desktop do you run?
Like this.